Is certainly going on in the 18th century. Plenty of people are using wild game to put food on the table. But the professional hunters we're talking about here are not necessarily going for food, they're going for the hides of the animals. And they are spending not weeks or a day out in the woods, but months, in fact, an entire year out in the woods trying to harvest as many deer and beaver hides as possible. This hunting is going on east of the Mississippi. There are lots of different kinds of game in the woods. You could probably think of the king of the forest in that time period, even east of the Mississippi, was the buffalo, the bison. There are lots of bison, not as many as there would be west of the Mississippi, where there are giant herds, tens of thousands of buffalo. For the professional hunter, you might think this would be the most sought after animal, but it turns out that the hides were not very valuable. Buffalo can be very, very difficult to kill. You couldn't use the hides for sale. You might use the hides for other purposes. You might use them for creating coverings for your deer hide that you are selling, but you're not generally going out and hunting lots of buffalo unless you're starving. And of course, the frontier is filled with other kinds of wild game, bear and elk. Again, both very useful, but they aren't the cash crop. They're not the one you're really going after so that you can take something back from the frontier to the civilized areas and make a lot of money. We do have situations where people are processing bison, maybe even salting it and sending it to Fort Pitt. But if it's gonna go out east and it's meat, well, venison's probably much better. But again, the cash crop is the hide. Hundreds of thousands of hides are being shipped off every year to Europe for processing. This is the most valuable product these hunters can come back to civilization with. Probably the most famous long hunter name is Daniel Boone, the kind of person who grew up in this area and had the kinds of skills that it took to survive for months and months at a time and live off the land. The main dish today is tongue. It's a very interesting cut of meat. There are times in our 18th century context where if you're going to take any particular piece of meat off an animal, then you're going to take the very best. The tongue being the very best cut of meat off of the buffalo, it's a win for the long hunter. It's a little interesting to prepare, at least in this kind of primitive cooking situation. We need to sear the tongue to get the skin to come off of it. Many times if we're cooking a tongue today, we will poach it or boil it and then be able to take the skin off the outer side. It's not so easy here by the campfire. We're just gonna put it really close to the fire and get it to dry a little bit so we can peel it off. And then we're just going to put it on a wooden stake and roast it over the fire. This was written in 1779. First scorch the tongue a little, then peel off the outside coating, then stick it on a spit made of spice bush with the lower end in the ground. If no spice bush is at hand, sassafras branch works just as well. So what did one of these hunting expeditions look like? It was lasting, again, months. Not weeks, not days, months or even a year, possibly even longer. If you're going to be bringing lots of things out of the frontier, you have to have some way to carry that. Someone's going to have a minimum of 3 or 4 pack horses, possibly many more. Because you want to come out with as many hides as possible, the only way for your trip to be profitable at all. And these expeditions aren't just a single person. You're going into a very, very dangerous environment. There are times when you have to defend yourself, and so you really can't do that with one person. So they're going out in larger groups, 3 and 4, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen men. You've got a camp, or a camp at least for a while. You might have to move from one spot to the other as you're hunting. You're going to have a half shelter like this. And you're again killing a lot of deer or beaver. Those animals have to be butchered, their skin has to be taken off, and then has to be processed. You can't just take a raw hide with you. You have to sort of half tan them so that you can pack them up and ship them out. And they have to last for months. You know, the ones you kill at the beginning have to last until you're ready to come out of the frontier. So it is a very dirty, nasty, hard job. It is all day long. You're going out hunting, you're bringing back the animals, you're processing, and starting out again the next day. There's a clash of cultures going on here, with the hunters coming off of the coast, and then we've got Native Americans. And the Native Americans here, they're not a monolith. You have different tribes, and sometimes they're at war with each other. At the same time, they're basically at war with these long hunters. So it is an incredibly dangerous spot to be. But it's not just people that you have to worry about. You have to worry about bears. You have to worry about mountain lions. You have to worry about buffalo. They're very dangerous animals to interact with, as well as something like elk. You're so deep in this forest that you're weeks away from resupply of just about anything. If your equipment breaks, you have to be able to fix it. And the most important thing to these hunters was their gun. That's a complicated piece of equipment in our 18th century situation. And you've got nothing but a campfire and maybe a very small hammer and a little hand vise to fix anything that might break. Another delicacy for these long hunters is bone marrow, and it's sort of the opposite of tongue. Tongue is a very easy thing to harvest from an animal. The bone marrow can be very difficult to harvest from the animal, so you've got to carve all the meat away to get to the bones. And you have to have a very large bone to get any decent marrow out of it. But the bones that were roasted, the marrow would soften up and they could scoop it out and spread it on bread or Johnny cakes for that very, very special flavor. I was trying to think of a comparison that we would have today, a job that we could do today that would be anything similar to what was happening with these 18th century hunters. Maybe you've seen the show Deadliest Catch. You're out there on the seas for months at a time. Or maybe the job of somebody on an oil rig. Again, away from civilization for months at a time, no real connection. These people usually have all their supplies along with them. The hunters, on the other hand, they were living on the environment for all that time. There are many times on the channel where we've talked about people in the 18th century using every little bit of something. So not letting anything go to waste. The hunters here are in a situation that many times is just the opposite. They are in a land of bounty. There are times when there is way more meat than anyone could possibly eat. And they'll just take little bits of an animal, the very, very best parts, and the rest they will just leave to rot. And yet, 3 or 4 days later, they're out of anything to eat and they are starving. This feast or famine situation is not with just these 18th century long hunters. It's happening with the Native Americans who are doing the same kind of hunting. When the hides are the cash crop, it doesn't matter whether they're Native Americans or these 18th century hunters, the meat part is not important, and so it just goes to waste. Johnny cakes would be another win for our long hunter. Ground corn, maize, that's something that they can bring along with them to the frontier. They might not want to use very much at a time because you can only bring so much, but that's that last little flavor of home that you can bring along with you. It's very easy to cook, and it has that amazing flavor that you're missing once you're out on this frontier for months and months at a time. This would be a line of work for a very special kind of person. Somebody who was able to live off the land for months at a time. Someone who's able to hunt and harvest animals by the hundreds if need be. Someone who is able to fix their own equipment. Somebody who's able to fight off bears and mountain lions and buffalo. He was somebody who could handle the pressure of living in this kind of environment. This is the Poor Hunter's Feast, and it is very good. When you're out in the wilderness, you're out in the outdoors, probably the most important thing you need is shelter. And I've got Dan Wowak of Coalcracker Bushcraft, and we're going to be talking about shelter and campsites and all that. What do we need to think about with campsites right off the bat?
Well, when you first get into camp in the evening, you want to start looking around at a few different things. First, we want to think about our location of exactly where we're going to set up camp, because it's important that we understand wind direction. We don't want the wind blowing in our face, especially when we're using a tarp shelter.
Okay.
We also want to look up and look around and make sure there's no dead trees that can fall on us and injure us while we're at camp. We also want to make sure that we're in an area that we have plenty of firewood for colder weather, and we also want to make sure there's a water source close, so if it becomes a more stationary camp, we have a good supply of water that we can bring into camp rather than trekking further out.
Probably other kind of dangers than falling trees. What else kind of comes to mind?
So we want to make sure that we're not in an area that can flash flood. If we're close to a river and it was raining, we don't want anything to flood us out. We want to look around the area for any type of poison ivy or poison hemlock that might be in the area, so we're not laying in that all night. If it's the summertime, we need to think about snakes, and depending on what region we're in, we need to also think about animals, and do we have protection from that if something's going to come into our camp.
So what about our spot here?
So this looks like a pretty good spot. We were looking around here right before we started this video. No widow makers, so nothing that can fall on us. We have water source not too far away. Good supply of firewood all throughout here, so I think that we're in a really good area.
So what do we need for our shelter?
So this shelter is super simple. It can get packed in your bedroll. All that we have is a tarp and a few pieces of rope, and that's all we're going to need. Tent pegs and toggles we can make right off the landscape here.
Great. So let's get started. So let's look at our exact materials we got here.
So we have an oilskin tarp,
Okay.
and this is a square tarp.
How
This is
big is it?
8 foot by 8 foot.
Okay.
So this is a good size for not only one person, but you put multiple people under this if it's really inclement weather.
Right.
And then what you're holding, we have some hemp rope,
Right.
so that'll always work well. I have a little bit of twine because in the backcountry you might not always have a lot of rope, so you got to make do. So we'll use a little bit
Right.
of cordage. And then one thing I didn't bring was tent pegs, so we
Okay.
have to make that off the landscape. So 2 styles of tent pegs you can make is take a Y branch and just cut it in this fashion, and when you drive it down, it'll hook it in place. The second is just a straight stick with a 7-notch cut, and this will work just as well. And I always like to also have some toggles, which are just straight pieces of wood, just to pull some sections of the tarp out.
Okay. And how much does that tarp weigh? You know?
That tarp weighs about 3.5 to 4 pounds.
Oh yeah. So you're not carrying too much. That'll fit right in your pack.
Yep,
Right
and a
here.
good thing with the tarp, it's super versatile, which I'm going to show you in a second. So not only can you set up a lean-to configuration, but we'll look at a plow point for more adverse weather conditions. The first shelter that we're going to set up is a lean-to, and this works really well just for all types of weather conditions. We just want to make sure when we set up that the wind is coming back. We want the shelter to take the brunt of the weather.
Right.
So in front of the lean-to then, we can set our fire, and we'll have a good open area that if it's adverse weather, we can work, anything like that. So the way we set this up is we come from waist level. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, but around waist level is best. There are a ton of different ways you can work your cordage to actually tie this up, but I'm going to show you a really easy way today. So waist level, we're going to just take that thinner piece of cordage and just wrap it around the tree like this, and we're going to tie a basic shoelace bow right on here.
Right. So we can untie it quickly.
So we can untie it and we can be on our way with it. Really easy. Now we're going to come across the front of this, and we're going to grab a second piece of our hemp rope, and we have tie outs on here, so I'm just going to run it through one of these tie out points.
Okay.
And I'm going to bring that to this tree. Same setup on this tree. I'm just going to pull that nice and taut, wrap it around, and tie that shoelace knot again. And we have the beginning of our shelter setup. Next, we need to put the tent pegs in. So John, if you want to pull your side first to get a good entente,
Okay.
nice and tight in back. There you go.
Go.
And then I'll tighten my side out real good and taut. Now, as you see, we are starting to have a shelter, but that middle sag is going to be a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, it might fill with rain or whatever.
Yep, so I'm just going to take a toggle on my center tie-out point with an extra piece of rope, and I can run that back to a tree that's really close here.
Right.
And then when I pull that, you can see we got a lot of lift on the inside.
It'll
So
give
it
you
gives
some
us
headroom,
way more room, and it's going to help run that water off of there.
Yeah.
And this could just get tied off real simply, however you wish to tie this off. And then we have ourselves a nice, easy shelter that's quick to set up and easy to set up.
That looks great.
Now we already had the lean-to set up tied off to one tree, so I took the rope down. Now we can actually just stake out the 3 corners and lift the center, and we have a plow point configuration for more adverse weather. So the first part of a plow point is always the back corner away from the tree. You want to get good tension on that. So I'm going to stake this out first, pulling it good and tight and driving that stake in.
Okay.
And then both of us can stake out each side just in a diamond or configuration. And then simply again, see we have that little bit of sag. I could just bring my rope around a tree that's in the back and begin to lift that up. And that's going to give us more height inside to do whatever we need to do while we're in the field.
And probably this arrangement of having a tree right here is really important. Is there any other thing we can do if we don't have a tree just in the right location?
If we don't have a tree, we can always put a tripod right in this back section and run it over the tripod. That would help tremendously.
So we could have a tripod here, and it's our temporary tree.
It's
right?
our temporary tree.
Okay, perfect. Tell me about fire, how to make it, what they would have had.
Well, their preferred method of starting fire would have been flint and steel. That's the technology they would have used. But before you even get to that, it's very important you know the triangle of fire. So the triangle of fire is heat, oxygen, and fuel. If you have all three elements, you'll have fire. If you lose any one of them elements, you don't have fire. So it really is broken down that easily. Now, fire is much more complicated because there's a lot of factors that go into it, but it always boils back down to that triangle of fire. So even when we used our flint and steel set, it's all about that triangle of fire.
Right.
So let's look at a flint and steel set here. So flint and steel technology it's quite simple actually. It's a hardened piece of metal and a piece of flint. And when you strike this, it's going to create a spark. So when I strike my striker off my piece of flint, we're creating spark. Now what a lot of people don't realize is that how this actually works is we have a hardened piece of steel, but we have a harder rock. So this rock is removing metal from our striker every hit. So when it removes that metal, it's combusting in the air, and that's giving us our low temperature spark. So with this alone, we can't have a fire. These sparks aren't just gonna just light a piece of wood on fire.
We could try it and it wouldn't burn.
It's not gonna do anything. So we need a medium to create an ember. And that's where either charred material of what's around us or natural char, or some type of charred cloth. And that's what we're gonna start with first, is charred cloth.
Okay.
So let's look at first the technique of actually how we're gonna ignite this char cloth. We want to think about our piece of flint as a razor blade, and that razor blade is removing metal from our striker. So at a 45-degree angle upward is going to be most ideal, and when you hit this with your piece of metal, you want to think about removing that material. So imagine you're using this razor blade to slice that off. So you don't need a lot of pressure, and it's more of a slicing motion than it is a hitting motion. So we're just slicing downward, and the majority of those sparks are rolling over the top. So at that point, we would take something like our charred cloth, and we place that on top of our flint that's at a 45-degree angle, and then what we can do is begin to strike this.
Oh, and you caught right there.
Give it a little bit of oxygen, and we have a lit piece of char cloth.
So we have heat, we have, we've got oxygen, but we need some fuel, really,
Yep,
right?
so we have an ember there, and now we need some fuel. So that's where a bird's nest or a tinder bundle come into play. So let's look at actually how we build that, and then we'll reignite a piece of this and blow it to flame.
Okay.
There's a multitude of different ways we can make bird's nests. So starting with just tree bark, we can look at inner bark from tulip poplar, inner bark from basswood, even bark from a cedar tree, or what I collected here earlier is some birch. So all of that will work really well. And it's always great to team different things up together. So not only the inner bark, but you can take something like some of this dried grass that we found down near the pond, and then something like this cattail, which fluffs up really well. It doesn't ignite too well, but it's a very good ember carrier, so it will extend our ember. So adding all of this into a bird's nest is really well. Once we place our ember inside and we add oxygen to that triangle of fire, we now have heat from the ember, fuel from our bird's nest, and we add the oxygen, and we should at that point have flame.
Right. So let's make a bird's nest.
Okay. One thing that is very important is when you create a bird's nest, you don't want to make it that it looks like a bird was sitting in it. You want more depth this way, front to back, rather than really big. So you can see I have some thickness there. So when that ember starts to burn in, it has somewhere to burn into.
Right.
So let me grab a little bit of this cattail, and I'll put this in here just as a extender, just like that. Now, if you can give me some char cloth. One thing that's always important with char cloth too is you can always make more. We can always make more out in the field. So if you ever think that the material is a little subpar, just grab a little bit more cloth.
Okay.
And we know it's been a little wet out here, so we can take a little bit extra, and then we can always make some after the fact. So I'm actually going to let you hold this while I ignite the char cloth. Same technique that we just looked at a second earlier. We're going to keep that piece of flint at a 45-degree angle, put our piece of char right on top of it, and get this ignited. Always put your fire-making device away. And now I'm going to place that right in the middle of that bird's nest, and I'm going to begin to give it some oxygen. Now as that burns and grows larger, I can start to close that in because we want to trap that heat in more and give it more fuel around itself. As soon as we have flame, we never want to blow on open flame. And then of course turn it on itself like this, because that's giving it more fuel, and we know heat rises. So we would take this and place it inside our fire lay.
Right.
And then once that's inside our fire lay, we want to think about how are we going to do this again. So that's where we're going to start to make more charred material. Now to make our charred material, what we want to do is first get some type of tin. So this is just a plain tin container. We're going to actually place this in the fire once we put our material in it. Now if the tin doesn't have any type of vent, we need to vent it somehow.
Right.
If it seems like it has a hinge or anything like that, it normally has enough airflow out of it that it's going to be fine.
Okay.
So we just open up our tin and we can place our material into it. Now material, we have a bunch of different options. Any type of natural cotton material will work just fine. We also collected some punkwood while we were out there. So punkwood is just that spongy wood that's starting to rot, but it's not totally rotted yet. We can just place that inside. Cattail works fine. Also any kind of pithy plant material that's dry will work good. We're going to place this in the fire and allow it to start to cook. You might see some flame and some smoke coming out of there. That is just the material we placed inside becoming carbon at that point. So it's really important we just keep it in there long enough. You can't overcook char, but you can undercook it. 10 minutes will probably be enough for what we have here, and then we'll test it out. Now our char material is off the fire for a good amount of time. We really want that to get to just room temperature in a sense, because if we open that up ahead of time, we introduce oxygen in that triangle fire, it will ignite into an ember.
And it'll burn up and...
Yeah, so we don't want that to happen. So we have to let this cool. A good rule of thumb is if you can handle it and hold it, it's fine. So we open that up and we look, everything has been charred from our punkwood to our cloth, and we are ready then to make our next fire.
And if it doesn't get all burned up properly?
Then you can just put it back in the fire and just char it a little bit more. So it's not rocket science, it's just very simple. So if it looks brown or there's any color left in the material, put it back in and let it cook a little bit more.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, if we lost our flint and steel, if we don't have it, what are our other options? I've got a flintlock here.
So flintlock is flint and steel technology.
Right.
So we can use the char cloth right in place of where the powder would be. Of course, you want to make sure that your gun's not loaded.
Right.
But we could just take a swatch of this, place it right down there in the pan.
Yep. We close it.
And then
we can just
go ahead and set it off, and it should ignite the char cloth.
There you go. It's all ignited, and we can just take that right out and put it into our bird's nest.
Yep, and that would be it. So, I mean, it's a very simple process, and there's multiple ways to do it.
Right, and we don't have to have an extra piece of equipment.
Nope.
We can just do it right there.
No.
What do you think about staying warm in this kind of weather?
Well, it's definitely very important, and I recently did some research and read that when the long hunters were out, their feet were so arthritic from the cold temperatures and the wet rain with their moccasins that they a lot of times had to sleep with their feet towards the fire just so they can get up and move around appropriately in the morning.
Yeah, it's always difficult in this kind of weather to stay healthy enough to continue to do what you need to do, and you know, staying warm when sleeping or whatever, or when it's really raining out.
Yep, and I think we can all agree that a good night's sleep is the best thing we can get. So we can look at now how not only to have our shelter set up, but we can talk about building a good debris bed and how to wrap up appropriately with our blanket.
So how do we stay warm?
Well, there's a couple different things we can do. The first thing is we can use a wool blanket appropriately, but before we even wrap up in our wool blanket, we can build a debris bed. And a debris bed is going to insulate us from the ground and help us with conduction. So it's not going to suck the heat out of us. In this type of environment, we can either use browse, so we can use something like evergreen. We can break the branches off, or we can use debris from the ground. So where we're at right now, we don't have any access to any evergreen, so what we're going to use is debris off the ground. It is wet, but that's just all part of it. It's better to have that insulative value on the ground and be a little bit wet than lay directly on the wet ground.
So our choices are what, leaves, or if we had really thick moss, or what else?
Yep, anything like leaves, moss, you can mix all that stuff in together, or those pine boughs. You really want, once it's compressed, about 4 inches of compressed material. So we really need to load the leaves in here to get on there and get really cocooned
So
down.
4 inches when it's compressed.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
12 inches is even better, but we'll go with 4.
We're gonna go out and get a bunch of leaves and see what we can do.
So this is really what we want to start with. It's very simple. You see there's not much to it.
Yeah.
We think there's going to be much more to it, but there's not. So what we want to first do is get any of these larger sticks that we might have picked up,
Right.
get them out of the way, and really just get the hump that's in the center of this out. We want to make it somewhat like a mattress. Once it's like this, it's then just to lay on it and see where we're at with our compression. So I'm really close to that 4
Seems
inches.
like you're kind of suspended above it.
Yep, and that's what we're looking for ideally. You need to remember that in any type of setting like this, it's not always going to be about the most comfort. It's just keeping ourselves safe in this type of environment. It's adding comfort, but it's also keeping us safe because it's keeping us warmer throughout the night. Now it's time to set our blanket up, but rather than just folding it over us and only having one layer of wool on the top and the bottom, we can really maximize the use of this blanket in cold weather like this. So to do so, we want to unroll this blanket and set it up that it looks like a diamond shape. It doesn't have to be perfect at first. We're just looking for that diamond shape. Then once we lay in the blanket, we want to create as many layers on top and on its bottom as possible. So we take this bottom piece, we fold it underneath our legs so it covered our feet, and then we take one of these ends, fold it across our body. This is giving us one layer on the top. Now we already have one layer on the bottom, but we're going to take this end that we just folded over and put this underneath us also. So now we have 2 layers underneath. Now we're going to put a 3rd layer over us on the top, like that. And then guess what? We're going to fold underneath. And now we have 3 layers underneath us. And now, take off our hat, and we can slide back and just make some very fine adjustments here in order to get comfortable. Now we have maximum coverage with our blanket, keeping us nice and warm.
So we're out in the wilderness. Maybe we don't have the right kind of coat, but we've got a blanket. How can we wear it?
Yeah, so there's several different ways we can wear it. The easiest way is to take your blanket and just basically lay it over your shoulders and use something called a blanket pin. And that pin pins through such as that and just rotates around. And that's going to just keep this in place like a shawl and give us that extra layer of warmth. But if you have a little bit larger blanket than this, there's also another option, and that's what I'm going to have you do right now.
Okay.
So we're going to put the short side just up over your head, just like it's draped over, like you're a little kid trying to hide under the covers.
Okay. Like that?
Yep, but we don't even need to go that much over your head, just a little bit right there. Now in the front, because he doesn't have a blanket pin with him, what we're looking for is we're going to use a thorn. And this thorn came off a locust tree. So we can take this in the front here and just pin that through. Now that's not going to hold as well as a blanket pin, but it's still going to work really good. You can then pull this back down, and now you also have a hood. Now all of this down here can get a little bit messy, so we can take just a very basic buckskin and tie this around us, just like that. And now we can have our hands out if needed. We can close in, and you can pull up your hood.
So we've got this one piece of garment, or this one blanket. During the day, it's cold out. We can wear this like a coat, and then later on in the night, all we have to do is take it off, and it's blanket.
Yep.
It's so versatile. I love this. Okay, so you're out in the woods. You got all this equipment. You got blankets and everything else. How do you carry all this stuff? Still have your hands free to do what you need to do?
So traditionally, a tump line was used many times, and this is a hand-woven tump line that I made. Thicker section throughout the middle that's actually going to be against us, and then 2 longer ends on each end, and then they're also split out. It just gives it a lot more versatility.
So
Total length of this is about 20 foot. So it's
like
really
a huge
long.
strap. Okay.
You can use it for not only carrying your blankets, but firewood. You can use it if you need to lash things up in the trees. All that we want to do is make sure this wide spot, this wide part of the strap is in front of the blanket, and then we take the 2 sides and cross over the blanket itself. And then we're going to roll the blanket around these two thinner straps. This is about the trickiest part, and the reason I say that is because we have to roll this and keep this out of the blanket. We're not going to roll that in.
Okay.
And now we could bring those straps into the center and begin to tie this off. There's no real particular way to specifically tie this off, but as long as you have this tied off so it holds your blanket in place. We can then take our tump line and throw it up over our shoulders and place it across our chest this way, or we can also place it across the front of our head and use our body weight to help hold that in place. The beauty of it though is it keeps our hands free, so we can hold our flintlock, we can still hunt, we can do work, and it's very easy to travel like this.
Sounds perfect. Tell me about cordage and what you're going to use it for.
So cordage is very valuable anytime you're around camp. Everything from making bundles of gear to shelter setups to different cook systems. So if we don't bring cordage with us, or we only have a minimal amount of cordage, how are we going to use the resources around us to make cordage? The cordage you have there is made from inner bark of tulip poplar tree. It's a very good, strong cordage. So we can take a look at actually how you process that and then make the cordage.
Let's go find some tulip bark to make into cordage.
So right here we have some tulip poplar. There's actually a small patch of it. If you look to identify tulip poplar tree, you see how it looks almost like a cantaloupe, and it has these chevron shapes up it. And what this actually is as the tree's growing, it wants to get up above the rest of the trees around it, so it's dropping its branches off. So that's an easy way to identify. But we have this piece here that's already starting to die off and is going to fall over anyway, so we can very easily collect this bark in this situation. All that we need to do is just pull it right off the tree. See how these long strips come off.
Right.
So we can take this back to camp and process this down. And once we have this process down, we can use this cordage for anything from hanging kettles to lashing tripods to making other cook systems, even tying up any type of bundles of gear that we have. So it's just a good multi-purpose item to be able to make for things that we don't have out here.
So we want the inner part of the bark, not the outer part of the bark,
inner
correct?
part, correct. So once you start to work with this a little bit, you'll see that that outer bark starts to fall right off.
Right.
So that outer bark is no good, just that inner bark is all that we're looking for.
What other kinds of trees can we use?
Basswood is another good choice. So anything that has long fibrous inner bark is going to work really, really well.
And this is died off. Is green going to work
green
just as well?
Yes, green will work just as well. If it's very dry, it doesn't break down as easily to be able to get these long strands, so you actually want to re-wet that, and it gives it some more moisture in it, and then you can work with it a little bit more.
So I imagine the green might be a little tougher to peel than something like this that's already
yes, if you can find this, it's just saving energy and saving resources, and we just go ahead with the stuff that's already died off.
Let's take this back to camp and work it up.
Okay.
So how do we turn this stripped bark into cordage?
Well, it's a very simple process. We can take this inner bark, and you see it's already breaking down into numerous strands.
Right.
So we just pull these strands apart. I can hand you some, and I'll keep some myself. Now, initially, we want to start to twist this, but we don't want to twist it dead center. We want to offset it, and that comes into play a little bit later on.
So like 1/3 of the way in?
Yeah, just 1/3 of the way, and just start to twist it over.
So am I twisting toward the long end or the short end?
Any way you want, because we're going to be using both. So you just start twisting. And you're going to twist this until the cordage itself, the future cordage, starts to turn on itself. Now, to make this 2-ply reverse wrap cordage, we want to turn one of these strands in one single direction. So in my case, being right-handed, I'm turning this inward.
Yeah, my natural inclination is go to the opposite direction.
Yes.
So, okay.
So once you get them twisted and they look round like this, at that point then you're going to rotate both of them the opposite direction. So I was twisting to the left, we're going to twist both of them to the right.
So is it kind of good that our bark has already sort of broken down because it's a certain age, it's been sitting on the forest floor, and it's wet? Does that help?
Wet's really going to help because that's going to give it more pliability. If it was really dry, you would want to wet it anyway. So you would get a pot of water and just dip it in and let it get some moisture in it. And that's going to allow us to twist this down to nice cordage. So we need to splice in more pieces, and this is always going to happen throughout your entire cordage making process because we can't get an infinity piece of inner bark. So
We could try.
at some point we're going to run short. So what we want to do is take the shorter end of the two, and that's
Right.
why we offset that
So,
at the beginning,
right.
because now we have a shorter end to splice. So if it is twisted, we want to untwist it and make it nice and flat and lay our second new piece
Right up against it.
right up
Okay.
against that. Just like this. And now we're going to continue our same process. So I'm going to continue twisting and spinning.
So those two are just going to get twisted
They're
up
gonna get-
together, and
Yep.
then they're going to get twisted together with the other side, and that will splice that up
Splice it
properly. Okay.
Once you get going with it, your muscle memory really kicks in and you just get a good rhythm with it. And then you're just grabbing your new piece, adding it in, and going along with it. Now to vary your thickness of your cordage that you're making, you just vary the thickness of the material you're using. So if
Okay.
you need a thicker piece or a thinner piece, depending on whatever project you're making it for, would depend on how much of the inner bark you actually gather.
So have you ever tried doing it with 3-ply or?
Yeah, so there's different techniques you can use with 3-ply that are a little bit more advanced, but majority of time 2-ply is going to be
Yeah.
more than strong enough, as you can tell,
Right.
for anything that we would need, from tripod lashings to bundling up any kind of animal pelts to
Right.
tying out gear.
Right, and this seems real flexible, real pliable. It's not
Yeah.
real stiff. What's this like when it dries out?
So it does stiffen up when it dries out. It's not extremely hard to the point that you can still put knots and things such as that in it. So I always tell individuals, if you use it, let's say to set up a shelter and it starts to dry out, you can always pour a little bit of water over that. It will soften it back up and you can pull it back out.
Right. So what, you got a 2 or 3 foot long piece?
Yes.
And how much do you think it'll weigh? How much weight do you think it'll carry?
I would say at least 30, 40 pounds probably.
Well, we got a
So-
pot here that's maybe, I don't know, it's probably a little less than 20.
Okay. So I think this will have no problem picking
Yeah.
that up.
Yeah, no problem at all. That's
Easy.
they're pretty amazing stuff.
Yep. And if you think about, if you're going to use something like that to support a water pot, or you have
Right.
to tie something off against a tree, it's more than enough tensile strength to be
And
able to do that.
And if you really wanted to, you could just bundle 2 pieces
Double it
together
up,
like
and you have
that,
even
and you've
more.
got twice as much.
Yep.
Yeah.
The biggest thing you need to keep in mind is that your splices are going to be weak points. So you want
Right.
to make sure that you splice enough together, not just a little bit. That way it's giving it more strength through that splice.
Right. So you probably want to get as long a strip as you can to be twisting up
Yep.
anyway. So you got fewer splices.
Exactly.
Right. And if you had 3-ply, you could spread that splice strength out over a longer
Yep.
distance too. Yeah.
Yep.
Amazing stuff. So what's our other option for simple cordage?
So there would be a lot of access to hides out on the frontier. So if we think about any type of brain tan, buckskin, we can use that by making a simple few cuts. So what I have here is a piece of brain tan buckskin. And this would be something common, not only used for leggings, but moccasins. So the men out there would have scraps of this at times that they
Sure.
can also do other things with. And we're going to talk about making cordage with this because it's a very viable option. If initially you think about just cutting a thin strip, that's good, but you can see with this scrap piece we can only get short strips, and we got to worry about knotting it. So another technique that we can use is by setting it down on something and taking our knife and cutting a circle. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle, just something circular. Okay, so once we have our circle piece cut, we can set our scrap off to the side. And then all that we would need to do now is just begin to cut this in a spiral fashion, and that's going to give us a lot more length than just cutting it in single strips. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to just get in here and start with cutting a small strip open, and then it's going to be easiest to hold this and then begin to cut around. Now, depending on how thick we want our cordage, depends on how thick we're going to make this piece. So you could see how much cordage we actually got from
that was just
that
a
little circle.
Yeah.
So you really
That's
can make a
amazing.
lot. But go ahead and give that a really good pull and see if you
Yeah,
can.
so it's like I could.
I mean,
No, no, I
really
don't
give it.
think I-
Yeah, I mean, you can really
Okay,
pull
you
it. And
can,
then
but
you can.
wow, I would
but
say
I mean, there was a lot of strength in
right.
there
What do you think?
to be able to pull that. And Normally, what happens with the breaks there is because my knife might have went off a little bit,
Got a little
so something
thin in
like
one
that. Got a
spot
little
or
thin,
whatever,
so
right.
yeah.
But it doesn't have, I mean, it doesn't really have too much of a grain to it or anything,
No.
so that even when you cut in a circle, it's still going to be really strong.
Right. So even tying out something like leggings, like you have some rope
sure,
there,
yeah.
you can use it like that. You'll be able to use it to tie up your bedroll. You can use it to tie up your tarp, anything like that would work.
And I suppose if you needed more strength, you could braid it together. Or you could do a lot to get a really heavy string. And this is brain tan. You could do it with rawhide.
Yes.
Or other.
Rawhide was traditionally used for bowstrings, so you would cut the same process, cut it the same way with the round circle, spiral, and then you would stretch it out while it's wet and twist it, and that would give you your bowstring.
Amazing strength there.
Yes.
I mean, that's a lot of strength. We're going to be talking about woodland cooking systems. Explain.
Yeah, so we're going to make a variety of different cooking systems. When you're around camp and you have just that campfire going, rather than sticking a piece of meat on a stick and struggling with it or
I do
burning
that.
it. Yep. So rather than doing that, you can make different cook systems with what's around us here in the environment to really make cooking more pleasurable, make your food better. Right. Not only make rotisseries, but we can make tripods so we can make better stews and really control what we're doing, because we need to think about the long hunters out there. They had very limited meat at certain times, so they didn't have an option of burning the meat or absolutely dropping it and losing it into fire, so they had to be a little bit more particular. So if you make a nice cook system, you can not only feed yourself better, but you do have multiple men. You could set up cook systems so everybody can do what they need to do around that campfire.
So what do we need for getting this done?
A variety of different branches out here, so we're going to go pick some and then we'll get started with the systems.
So what kind of species and type of wood were we looking for here?
So it depends on the cook system. Species doesn't matter too much as long as it's green wood. We don't want any type of dead wood for the simple fact it's going to be exposed to heat at some point. So we don't want that actually catching on fire. So green wood's going to be best. For the tripod, which I really feel is a quintessential camp tool, because not only can we cook with it, but we can use it for a smoke system to smoke meat, but we can also use it for shelters, smoking hides. It's very important. So with something like this, we want long, straight sticks about 1 inch in diameter. Is good enough. That's going to be good and strong if it's green wood, and about 5 to 6 foot in length is most optimal. You can make them shorter, but this longer length just seems to be a little bit
more
better.
Options.
Yes, exactly. So the process can be very simple or very complex. We're going to take the middle of the road. We're going to put a proper lashing on this. So if cordage was at a very minimum out in the field, you can just use 1 or 2 wraps and make it sort of work, but we'll put a good lashing on here, and then the way we're going to lash this, we can always remove that cordage when we're done. So it's a very simple thing.
So we can reuse it,
Yes. So first thing we want to do is get the bottom of our sticks lined up, and again, I cut all of these very close to the same length. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the sticks where they lay very evenly. Yep. And I'll take a piece of cordage that I have. Now how you start this can vary. There's no really proper way, so I'm just going to put a loop on here that has a slip knot and start to tighten this down. Now anytime we wrap around the sticks this way is a lashing, and the wrappings inside are the frappings. So first we're going to put a lashing. So we're going to begin to just wrap this around these sticks, and just take your time with this and get it to lay in there properly.
So we looking to bind these up really tight?
Well, you can. It depends on what project. If this was a shelter, I would really want to bind these up good and tight so it doesn't move. One option you could do to bind these up tight is take just an extra piece of stick that I gathered while I'm out there and use it as a toggle just to tighten that up. Now you see how that bunched up? We don't want that to happen. So we're going to just open that back up a little bit and use our knee right here to keep that in line, and I'm just going to tighten that down. So for every 3 lashings, 1 frapping is a good idea. So it doesn't have to be exact, but as long as we're close with that, I think it's going to hold up just fine for us. So I'm done my lashings there. I will grab my toggle again just to put a little bit of tension on that. Now I'm going to begin my frappings. So I'm going to go in between each of this and around. And this is really what's going to bind up and make this work more properly. You might have to play around with this a little bit to get it to work.
Between,
Yep. and I'm just going to continue. I'll put 2 frappings
Okay, around, in between each one of those,
in
right?
between each one of those. And really that'll be it then at this point. So we made our lashings and our frappings. Now to finish this off, you could do several different things. We're just going to put a half hitch in here just to hold
Something
it.
simple, yeah.
Just something simple to hold it in place, and we will be set to go. So should we give this a try now over the fire
we'll see.
pit? All right, so very simple, just open it up. And you can feel it's a little bit tight now, but that will adjust over time as we loosen up on that.
And this is our leftover?
Now, yeah, so we always want to make sure that we have leftover cordage because it's very simple. Then we take that toggle I was using to tighten down that lashing, and with just a very simple slip knot, so I place that simple toggle on if you'd like to grab that pot, and then we just use that bail to hold our pot in place.
Look at that.
Now the beauty of this system is, number one, we can make very fine adjustments by just sliding our tripod in. See, we got some height, or if you want to grab that leg and open that up, we can even get lower. And then if we need other type of adjustment, we can also always wrap this over the top.
Sure.
And we can really get that high off of the fire. And that way, if we need to simmer something, it works really well. So you can see how well this works with something.
Yeah, it's so simple and
Very
it's
simple.
so versatile.
Yep.
So what have we got here?
So we're going to make a pot suspension system. And the beauty of this system is that you can put multiple pots on the campfire. You can make it as big as you would need. So if you have a real big long fire and multiple minute camp, everybody can use the fire equally. So what we're going to need to do is we need 2 uprights that are Y branches.
Okay.
Now these can vary in length. I like to say around 3 foot in length is best with a Y on top. And then on the outside of your fire pit, you're going to just push them straight down inside. So if you want to give a little push down at that one, get them as level as we can. And then what we're going to do is just take a straight branch that's long enough to go across both of them. Just like that. And you can level this system out as much as you would need to, but it looks pretty good right now. So you might be thinking, what actually are we going to do with this? I mean, we just have a bar hanging there. Well, we make hangers. So there's different types of hangers we can make. This hanger right here is just a Y branch, so it was growing up this way. We trimmed it here, and I put a notch up top. But we're actually going to flip that to use it. So when we hang our pot, we use that notch, and we can hang it this way over the fire. You can put multiple notches up on here, and that will allow the pot different heights depending what you need.
Sure.
Then we can also take 2 Y branches if we have some extra twine or cordage with us and tie them off. So I have 1 Y branch that was growing this way and another one that was growing this way, lash them together, hang that on here,
so
and then you could hang your pot on there also. So as you can see, we're a little close to the fire there, so making multiple hangers is going to be most beneficial. And again, you could take this up as high as you would want or as low as you want, depending on what you're actually doing.
And we could hang other things on this other than the pots. We could probably, you could even hang a piece of meat on that if you needed to.
Yep, or if
whatever.
you took sliced meat and you skewered it through, you can hang it almost like a kebab and then just cut it as it cooks.
Right. So what do we got here?
Well, this is very similar, the setup to the last pot suspension system. So we still have the Y upright branches, but you can see that I lowered them a lot.
Okay.
And the reason I lowered them is we're actually going to make a rotisserie. So if we have any type of meat source, we can actually rotisserie it over the fire. Now to do that, rather than just that single straight stick, I took another Y branch and then I lashed a smaller branch onto that. And the reason for that is if we put just a piece of meat on a round branch, it's going to spin and we can't get that rotisserie effect. So this is going to work as a clamp. Once we skewer our meat and tie it down, then the meat's not going to go anywhere. We can lay this across the Y branch just like this. And the reason this is a Y is because we can then use that to
incrementally rotate it.
Yes. Yep. So we're going to do that, and we can just turn it around that way. Now, this morning I actually harvested a rabbit, so we can put the rabbit right on the skewer and take a look at what it looks like.
Okay.
So I now have this lashed on, and you can see as I rotate this, it's not sliding on the spit itself.
Right.
So we can set it right in place here like this, and then as we need to rotate that, we would just do so. So it works really well this way to just constantly keep rotating that and get a good, nice, even roast all around it.
Well, we've got meat, we got the cooking system. I suppose we should get a fire going and cook this rabbit up. This reminds me so much of what's going on in Nicholas Cresswell's journal. They're traveling into the backcountry. They don't have very many provisions, and many of the provisions they have with them get spoiled along the way. They are eating off the land as they travel. You know, whatever game they can get a hold of, that's what they're cooking. They're eating in the most simplistic way possible.
So the rabbit has been cooking now for about 25 to 30 minutes. And in the spirit of the long hunter, we're just gonna eat right off the stick here. So we'll cut ourselves a little section. I'm gonna cut some of this back strap off for us, right through here. Get you some meat right off that.
Hey, it looks done, yeah.
Yeah. I'll give it a little taste here.
Smoked rabbit.
Yeah, rotisserie style.
Yeah.
Really good. And if you're hungry and didn't eat for a couple days, it'd be really good.
Yeah, and no gaminess at all on this thing.
No.
It's wonderful, basically chicken flavor, really.
Yeah.
We've been talking a little bit about, well, a lot about Nicholas Cresswell's journal. Nicholas Cresswell was a young Englishman. He was touring North America looking about what his future life was going to be like. He's wondered if this was where he wanted to settle. And he had some adventures in the back country. And let me read this particular journal entry, and we're going to try to reproduce this. This is May 18th, 1775, and he's probably in what is now Kentucky. He says, all hands are employed in curing our buffalo meat, which is done in a peculiar manner. The meat is first cut from the bone in thin slices like beefsteaks. Then 4 sticks are stuck in the ground in a square form. Small sticks are laid on these forks to form a gridiron about 3 feet off the ground. The meat is laid on this and a slow fire put under it, and it is turned until it is done. And then he says this is called jerking the meat. That's what they referred to it during the time. It answers very well where salt is not to be had, and will keep a long time if it is secured from the wet. So does this sound like a typical, you know, like cooking method you would do?
Yeah, so anytime you're going to preserve meat, smoking's a great resource to do that, and you can use just about everything in the environment to help us get
right.
that
And
going.
he describes
exactly what
a
we
method
need to do.
just like we've kind of done a little bit earlier. So we're going to reproduce that. What do we need for this?
So we're going to get the 4 sticks that have Y's on the top, so 4 sticks, and then we'll get a bunch of straight sticks that are going to create that grill top in a sense.
Right.
And then once we lay that over, we're going to take it one step further though. We'll put a tripod over it and then wrap it with some extra material that we have here, and that's going to help trap the smoke in and allow it to cure a little bit quicker.
So I got our buffalo meat that we cut up earlier. If you're going to try this at home, make sure to try to get this cut across the grain as much as possible. This is regular buffalo, and we're just going to lay it out on our gridiron here. There you go. Have a piece here. Some of these pieces aren't beautiful, but you know, sometimes the buffalo fights you. So
now we're smoking the meat, so we have the meat set on our rack that we built. What we're going to do is take just an old scrap of cotton canvas, and we're going to wrap it around this tripod. It's going to help block that smoke. Right now we don't have a lot of smoke, but we have a good bed of embers, so we can feed that with dry wood. We don't want a lot of flame and heat, so we'll feed that with not only dry wood, but then green wood, because that green wood's going to give a nice smoke, and we really want this to get super smoky in here and dry this meat out. So we'll just take this old canvas and wrap it carefully around this tripod to start to trap in all that smoke. When you're doing this, you always also want to be careful that none of this is down too low that it's going to actually catch fire, so we can just fold that up the best we can, and that's going to help trap a lot of that smoke inside to dry out that meat. So let's get that fire stoked up and we'll be good to go. A lot of the skills that I have learned were passed on from many different individuals over the years. If it was not people who directly spoke with me, it's from their writings and teachings that they have written in books and journals. I would like to pass a lot of this information on to my son so he has a better understanding of what it took for individuals to come to this new land and prosper and make lives for them and their own families.
here is our dried buffalo meat, kind of smoked and dried, and this is what they would have been doing on the trail to preserve their buffalo. And Cresswell talks about this completely, gives us this whole process. So we tried this out. It took longer than I expected. We dried it for several hours, and then we kind of basically had to let it go all night long before it really got nice and dry. And really what we're looking for is drying it, not cooking it. And you can see by these finished pieces, they're kind of black and they kind of crack open. They're not real soft. If they're soft, they're gonna rot. And he talks about how if you keep them dry, they're gonna last a long time. Now, maybe for a long time for him was, a couple of weeks or a month, but now the question is, what do we do with these? Now we can try eating these just like they are. Here you go, Dan, you give one, get a try, pick one out there. In this state, it's tough, it's dry.
It's meat.
Yeah, it's
if
meat.
If you're hungry, it'd be great.
Right. It's good. Definitely, with the buffalo meat, you got a little different flavor than beef. Nicely smoked, though.
Really
got
good smoke flavor.
A nice little smoke flavor to it. They wouldn't necessarily just eat it like this. So they might use this, reconstitute it in a stew, put it in the boiling water, kind of let it, kind of reconstitute itself, expand a little bit. It's going to probably make a really, really interesting stew. Mix it with some of your other ingredients, because you don't want to just be eating this on the trail all the time. You want to mix it up, right?
Yep, and I think too we need to realize that they were eating to survive.
Yeah.
So many times now we think about eating for pleasure, where they were eating because they needed to eat to live. So something like this is a pure survival food. A lot of protein, a little bit of fat in there. It's great to get you through and get you to the next meal.
Yeah, it gives you energy and all that. Really, the kind of more fat the better, really, in this kind of circumstance. He even, Cresswell talks about, he complains that these guys don't want to stick around to take the time to make these provisions, to dry this stuff out. But if you have this dried, ready to go, when you're, headed out to your event, you can have this. Perfect. If you're doing something like Long Hunter, where they would have had this sort of provision with them. So what would you need? A little bit of this?
A little bit of flour or cornmeal, and I think you really have a full setup of being able to go out and then hunt for the rest of your food, fish, and then have this as a backup.
We're going to be cooking a venison heart. Why are we using venison? Why are we using a heart?
So venison would have been something that the frontiersmen would have been able to hunt, and we're using heart meat because while at camp, if we ran out of the good meat that we wanted, maybe the back straps and hindquarters, if we ate all of that and the weather became inclement, or we were locked into a location that we couldn't move from and game just wasn't available for us to hunt at that time, or we had no luck while we were out there, we're still going to want to eat. So those organs are still a viable option, and it's food until we can get something a little bit better.
Right. There's some great stories in Nicholas Cresswell, some really interesting parts where they're hunting buffalo. They'll kill a buffalo, and then a day later, 2 days later, they're out of food again. They're moving, they're eating the best parts of the animal, and then they're probably leaving all the rest behind. But then later on, they're starving, and boy, they'll eat anything they can get, even if it's a deer heart. So that's what we're going to be cooking up today. We're using some of the simplest utensils today, along with simple provisions that we would have along with this. Obviously, we've got the deer heart. We've got a little bit of fat here. It's actually a little bit of suet from the animal. And the other common ration or provision that we would have along with this is cornmeal. So we got a little bit of cornmeal. That's about it. All we need is a frying pan, just a few little utensils. So let's get this cooking up. We've got some slices of heart here, nice and thin. This can cook up tough, so we want to make sure to slice it nice and thin. And we're just going to bread it in a little bit of cornmeal. Pop it in the frying pan. I've already got the suet going. So heart does show up in regular 18th century cooking, but not quite like this. This is so simple. In 18th century recipe books, generally heart shows up. They talk about cooking the pluck of an animal, and the pluck is things like the heart, the lungs, and some other components. You might have chitterlings, other parts of the offal of an animal, but they called it the pluck, which I think is a nice term for it. And they would use those in things like haggises and other cooking methods like that, where you would sort of hash it up and boil it in an animal's stomach or even in a pudding bag. So there are several different recipes that use pluck, but it doesn't show up a lot in that regular kind of fancy cooking in the cookbooks. Well, our heart is off the fire. It looks like it's cooked through. It doesn't take very long with nice thin strips like that. So what do you think? Is this ready?
I think it looks good, but I think a little bit of nutmeg would set this off.
You know, I just happen to have my little pocket spice kit here. It's basically full of nutmeg. There's a little bit of salt and pepper in there too. But we can try just a little bit of nutmeg to just set these off. There you go. Can't wait to try this. I'm worried that's going to be way too tough. We're going to find out. Hey, I can taste that nutmeg.
Mm-hmm. It's actually really good. It's not too tough.
No, it's not tough at all.
The cornmeal and suet, I think, also give it a good taste. It
Yeah.
just, rather than just grilled meat, it tastes a little bit more different than grilled meat. So.
Right. Now, you could take these and, you know, kind of brown them up. You could put these in a stew, you know, in this circumstance. In fact, Nicholas Creswell talks about times when he's got just a little bit of flour and he doesn't want to waste them making bread. He wants to use them in a soup to kind of thicken it up. He would do the same thing, slice up the meat small, cook it a little bit, toss it in there, make a stew with water, a little bit of flour, kind of thicken it up. This, hey, it turned out really good for such a simple, quick way of cooking. Almost no ingredients whatsoever. We just need a little bit of frying pan, a couple little eating utensils that we would have with us anyway as tools when we're out here in the woods. So, wow, if you get a chance, try something simple like this. You're out in the backwoods, and one of the things that we've got that you would think that you would get rid of, you'd throw it out, would be the fat off the inside of a hide, right?
Yes, exactly. So we have a raccoon hide actually here. And during the long hunter era, they would bring a lot of hides back. We know that they would go out and trap and bring hides back. And to process a hide correctly, once you have it skinned out and you have the carcass outside the animal, we need to remove this heavy fat layer that's inside. And that's going to keep the skin from actually rotting. So we need to remove that. But when we remove that fat, we can utilize that around camp to not only protect our equipment, but also protect some of the gear that we wear, such as moccasins and leggings.
So the main thing they were doing out here was hunting, and one of the things they were doing is bringing back hides, and every single one of those hides would have to be processed right there in the field, right?
Yep, right at their camp they would have to process.
So all that, every single one of these hides would have to be scraped, and so that's what you're going to do with this one today.
Yep, and then we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to make something called fat wax, and that fat wax is that protectant I was talking about. Right here we have our raccoon hide, and what we need to do now is take this heavy layer of fat off. So it's turned inside out, the hair side is in. And ideally, to preserve this hide, to be able to do anything else with it, we need to get this fat off. And we're going to take this fat off just quickly. What we're using here is a deer scapula, because this is something, again, that's outside. It's one less piece of gear that we would have to carry around camp. So all we're going to do is begin to scrape this fat. And it comes off quite easy, as you can see.
Yeah.
So as I get that off, what I'm going to do then with it is take some of this. See, it almost pulls off, and I'm going to just drop it into my pot, and we're going to render that down. So I'm going to continue this process to try to gather as much of this fat off. Ideally, to preserve the hide, we want to get all the fat off.
So this is raccoon. The other obvious animals are deer. What other kind of animals would they also do this with?
Bear has a lot of good fat, so they call it bear grease. You can make the same idea with it. So the beaver also has a lot of fat on it. It would work really well. Something like a fox or a coyote or even a possum, they just don't have enough fat to really render it out to do anything like this.
So how long do you think this is going to take to render down?
The amount of fat we have in there, it'll probably take anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. So you just want to just slowly cook this, allow that fat to have render down, so basically melt and liquefy, and I keep stirring it around. We don't want it to burn or anything like that, so we want to just take our time. There is some hair and there's some grizzle in there, which isn't a big problem because we're not using this to eat, we're using this to treat tools in the field.
Right, and we'll know it's done when we've got mostly liquid and then whatever kind of connective tissue kind of gets scraped off to the side. The cracked ones.
The cracked ones, yep.
Right. hardener that we need for this is some melted beeswax. So this looks like it's cooked down really well. Is it ready to go?
Yeah, at this point it's ready to go. What we're looking for is 50% tallow, 50% wax.
We got beeswax here, and it's pretty much melted.
Okay, so we can take our tallow right off of our fire, and I'm gonna mix these two together. Try to keep as much of the
solids out
as possible. Give this a little mix, and then we're gonna take this and we'll put this in a smaller tin. That way it's more portable.
Yeah, we can store it right in here.
Yep. Now that we have the wax and the tallow mixed, we can just let it sit and cool. And once it's cooled down, then we can apply it to whatever we would need. The fat wax is now hardened up, so you can use this on a multitude of different things. We can use it on any type of metal, so we can take something like my tomahawk here, and we could just work that onto the metal, and that's going to give it a good protectant so it doesn't rust in foul weather like this. It also works really well on a wood handle. It's going to help protect that wood to not let it dry out and crack, anything like that. It works very well for knife sheaths, anything that's leather works good for. Something even like my leggings, if I want to add some water protectant to it, I can do that. Flintlock rifle, this works really well for also. So there's just a huge variety of uses. And in worst case scenario, if you're out in the backcountry and you have very bad chapped lips or anything like that, you can also use it as a lip balm itself. So you can put it on there and it moisturizes.
Multi-purpose.
Yep.
Kind of protectant and lubricant for whatever you need.
Yep.
Sounds great. So it's amazing what you can do with a little bit of beeswax and the fat left over on the inside of a raccoon skin. I am amazed, and it was really actually a very simple process, although scraping the fat off didn't look that easy. I mean, that's pretty tough.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a learned skill, so once you learn that skill, it becomes pretty easy.
And probably is harder and easier with different kinds of animal hides.
Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So, but still, an amazing process, and what you get left over, I mean, this finished product seems to be useful for just about everything. I mean, waterproof your clothing, waterproof your shoes, protect your metal equipment. So, tremendous quantity of uses that you can use it for. So, I'm just flabbergasted. It's just great to watch the process and a lot of fun. So, thank you, Dan, for bringing this wonderful, sharing with us these skills and techniques. It's been so much fun working with Dan. If you're interested in bushcraft, if you're interested in learning about how to survive in the wilderness, make sure to check out Dan's YouTube channel, and we'll put a link down in the description below, and also the Coal Cracker Bushcraft School. So make sure to check out that. That'll be down in the link also down in the description section. So thank you so much, and thank you guys for watching. In this episode, we're mixing two things that have gotten a lot of interest lately on the channel. One is North American corn recipes, and the other one is eels. That's right, we're going to be working with eels. Thanks for joining us today. So located just here, 15 miles south of our store in northern Indiana, there's a waterway, a river, and it's called the Eel River. There is this hidden feature right on the river that one could easily miss if they didn't know what they were looking at. This is a stone fish weir that was built by the indigenous peoples long ago. The fish weirs were used to harvest fish. They worked by funneling migratory fish into a single point of the river, where basket traps were placed to collect the fish. And in our research, we found two different 18th century travel journals, including that of John Heckewelder, a Moravian missionary who lived among the Lenape people. These journals mentioned the Eel River Indians, the native peoples whose name was derived from this very same river. So we're pleased today to present a traditional food that was likely enjoyed by native peoples and settlers alike. We're especially excited about this dish because of its possible connections to the history of this area, history that's right under our feet right here in northern Indiana. So what we're doing here today is another take on succotash. We have done two different episodes on succotash, a summer succotash and a fall succotash. but this is just another kind of variation on it. But this one's got a little different ingredients. Now the main ingredient on all these things, a real staple here, is corn. And we're starting off with a dried hominy corn. This corn has already been processed in a process that the Native Americans used so often that would strip the hulls and kind of sort of cause it to swell up, and then they went ahead and dried it. The corn we're using today is actually from our good friends at the Iroquois White Corn Project. Great people. The corn that they use is a variety that's over 2,000 years old, and it works really well. This is the hulled white corn product, which is a kind of a hominy corn. This is great stuff. The best way to get this corn ready to go into our succotash is to actually cook this overnight in a slow cooker. You can do this without a slow cooker, but you'll need to simmer it for several hours to really get that water into it. It'll puff up, and you can really see that it's definitely changed its texture. But a slow cooker overnight on low with several inches of water over that, and it absorbs a lot of water, like say rice, takes up a lot of room. But this is, you're going to need to pre-prep this, okay? So we can go ahead now and for our succotash here, we've got about a gallon of water in our pot, and I'm going to put in a goodly portion of our prepped corn. Now for the rest of our ingredients, we have squash, one of the ones that's mentioned, one of the things that's mentioned in some of these writings. We also have a root vegetable here, and some root vegetables are mentioned. This is celery root, and we'll put in a little bit of that. I mean, you could put potatoes, I suppose, or maybe a parsnip. Now I've got some heritage beans here. These are soaked beans. These are actually given to us by our good friends down at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, an amazing, wonderful historic site that's down there. That's early 19th century, wonderful site. If you're in that Indianapolis area, you really got to check the site out. They provided these beans for us. We soaked these beans overnight. Let's toss some of those in. And the last thing I'm going to put in now is a little salt and pepper. It's not necessarily likely that, of course, Native Americans would have had salt and pepper at least early on, but we're going to add it for our flavor. Now, before we put in our last ingredient, this is actually going to need to simmer for a little while, or actually boil for a little while, probably 45 minutes, we're guessing, but until these root vegetables get nice and soft and the beans have softened up a little bit. And the final ingredient that's going to go in here, it's not ready yet to put these in, but the eels get to go in next. In the writings of George Laskill in 1794, he mentions the Lenape and the Iroquois peoples. They'd made soup or stew with corn and smoked eels. These eels are going to need to have a little prep work done to them, so I'm actually going to have Kevin come in, talk to us a little about eels, and maybe do a little work to them.
You know, we've been wanting to do an eel recipe for a long time, and frankly, we haven't, because we haven't been able to find them. And we finally found a source for smoked eels. These eels come out of Holland. I've always kind of wondered, why is there this river in Indiana called the Eel River? Because there aren't eels in Indiana. Interestingly, though, there used to be. Eels are a migratory fish, and they swam thousands of miles up the tributaries to spawn, and then they would swim back out to the ocean. And so the eels in Indiana, the eels in the Eel River, would actually end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Today in North America, you're going to find eels primarily in saltwater tributaries. Eels, they were everywhere in North America. Very, very common, used to be, no longer today. I'm going to show you how to prepare one of these eels. Now, this eel is very perishable. It's smoked, yes, but probably the way that Native Americans smoked them would have been to smoke them until they were dry, a lot like a jerky. So we're going to use what we have. So here we go. I'm going to start by taking one of these eels. Now these eels have already been gutted, so I'm going to start just by cutting their heads off. I'm going to cut behind the small fin right here. You can save these for later for like soup, things like that. I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to run the knife right along the backbone. The rib bones are very, very fine, and we're probably just going to end up with those in our meat, and you probably won't even know that they're there, all the way to the tail. Now, this eel is already fully cooked, and so it's very delicate. So if you're using an eel like this, you're going to have to be careful with this process. Now, beyond this, because those rib bones are so fine, I'm not going to worry about them. I'm going to try and get to our spine, and I'm just going to pull this spine out, try and save as much meat as I can. Now I have these two fillets, a little rough, but they'll do for our soup. Now, you can leave the skin on and you'll get more of that of the fish flavor and the smoky flavor in your soup. I think John's going to thank me later for doing this, by the way. I'm going to go on ahead and cut the meat off of the skin, and it's real easy to do. And I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to cut it into chunks. And we're going to get some real nice smoky flavor from some of that meat. So our eel meat is ready to be added to the soup.
I'm going to go ahead and put the eel skins in just for about 10 minutes or so to release some of that flavor, and then we'll pull them back out a bit like a bay leaf. And now in goes the meat. Now this is really only going to need to cook for another 5 minutes or so. And now at the very end here, we're going to put in just a little chives at the very top, and now it's almost ready to serve. Here it is.
In November of 1966, Walt Disney was diagnosed with lung cancer. Famously a heavy smoker for most of his life, it wasn't entirely surprising, but it was still a shocking discovery that unfortunately came far too late to treat effectively. The procedures he endured, including the full removal of his left lung, did little to stave off the illness that at this point had spread throughout his entire body. Barely a month later, on December 15th, he would pass away due to complications caused by the cancer. 2 days after his death, he was cremated, and his ashes were eventually kept at a family plot in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, a memorial that you can visit to this very day. But it's likely that you've heard a different story about Walt Disney's death. That Walt Disney wasn't actually cremated, that he had been cryogenically frozen in hopes of bringing him back to life someday. There's a lot of factors that fed into this urban legend. Some of the reporting around Disney's death at the time was a little confusing, some of it fraught with misinformation. And at the time of his death, cryogenic freezing was seemingly making advances and even inviting its first real candidates. With Walt Disney's vast resources and his known interest in futuristic technologies, it's absolutely plausible that if anyone would be taking this leap into the future, it would be Walt Disney. Although cryogenically freezing a person to bring them back to life at a later date is largely believed to be impossible, there is a sizable, deeply committed contingent of people who disagree. And as of me making this video, there's roughly 500 people that are currently frozen, with thousands more on waiting lists. But there's several others who were frozen in the past and didn't quite get the results they signed up for. So for today, let's talk about the truth, the myth, and the horror of cryogenic freezing. This video is sponsored by Incogni. Your personal data is worth a lot of money, and no matter how careful you are, it still seems to get out there. You're just constantly hearing about new data breaches. Data brokers collect your name, address, sometimes even your social security number. You have a legal right to get this information removed, but data brokers make it as difficult as possible to do. That's where Incogni comes in. Incogni helps protect your privacy by reaching out to these companies on your behalf, requesting the removal of your data and dealing with their objections. As Incogni does its thing, you'll get a list of these companies, how sensitive the data they have is, and how far along in the process Incogni is. When I first spoke about Incogni back last December, I mentioned how I'm constantly getting these spam calls, usually in Chinese for some reason. In the time since then, I've been getting significantly less. Honestly, I can't remember the last time I got one of these phone calls. So go to incogni.com/Wang and use code WANG. You'll get an exclusive offer of 60% off. That's incogni.com/Wang, use code WANG, or click the link in the description below to take your data off the internet. There's always been something that's fascinated me about cryogenic freezing, although I never really looked that deeply into the technology. I remember one year for a school science fair, I tried to cryogenically freeze crickets in Tupperware in my freezer. Unfortunately, I was not able to bring them back to life. I think I might have tried this because I remember reading about this thing you can do where you freeze a fly, then you tie a string around it and unfreeze it, and you got a fly on a leash. Apparently that actually is a thing you can do, though. There's actually a guy on YouTube, Drum Lewis, with a video of him doing this. And while I was looking up whether or not you can actually do this, I came across this horrifying Reddit comment about a guy who tried this with a goldfish. When I was in 5th grade or so, as a science experiment, I left a goldfish in a bag of water in the freezer overnight. The next afternoon, I thawed out the solid block of ice and successfully revived the goldfish. He seemed no worse for wear, until 3 days later, all his skin fell off and he died. This information removed, but data brokers make it as difficult as possible to do. That's where Incogni comes in. Incogni helps protect your privacy by reaching out to these companies on your behalf, requesting the removal of your data and dealing with their objections. As Incogni does its thing, you'll get a list of these companies, how sensitive the data they have is, and how far along in the process Incogni is. When I first spoke about Incogni back last December, I mentioned how I'm constantly getting these spam calls, usually in Chinese for some reason. In the time since then, I've been getting significantly less. Honestly, I can't remember the last time I got one of these phone calls. So go to incogni.com/Wang and use code WANG. You'll get an exclusive offer of 60% off. That's incogni.com/Wang, use code WANG, or click the link in the description below to take your data off the internet. There's always been something that's fascinated me about cryogenic freezing, although I never really looked that deeply into the technology. I remember one year for a school science fair, I tried to cryogenically freeze crickets in Tupperware in my freezer. Unfortunately, I was not able to bring them back to life. I think I might have tried this because I remember reading about this thing you can do where you freeze a fly, then you tie a string around it and unfreeze it, and you got a fly on a leash. Apparently that actually is a thing you can do, though. There's actually a guy on YouTube, Drum Lewis, with a video of him doing this. And while I was looking up whether or not you can actually do this, I came across this horrifying Reddit comment about a guy who tried this with a goldfish. When I was in 5th grade or so, as a science experiment, I left a goldfish in a bag of water in the freezer overnight. The next afternoon, I thawed out the solid block of ice and successfully revived the goldfish. He seemed no worse for wear, until 3 days later, all his skin fell off and he died. In any case though, humans aren't goldfish and we're not flies unless, you count Seth Brundle. But I think the Walt Disney myth is most people's point of reference for the idea of cryogenically freezing a human. So let's take a look at why this belief exists. The urban legend is often said to have been started by a magazine called The National Spotlight. The National Spotlight was known for stories like Cured by Elvis's Healing Hands, America Needs Nudism to End Crime, and How UFOs Control Our Minds. Clearly a very trustworthy news source. Supposedly, shortly after Walt Disney died, a reporter for the National Spotlight snuck into the hospital he was being treated at disguised as an orderly. He broke into the storage room where he made a horrifying discovery: Walt Disney's body, sealed and frozen in a tube. That being said, I've seen some doubt that this article actually exists. I've even seen doubt that the National Spotlight exists, although we can go on eBay right now and buy a few issues, so it did exist at some point. Some publications such as Snopes, perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of citing this impossible to find National Spotlight article, claim that the source was actually a French publication called Ici Paris in 1969. But I did manage to find a few publications that make reference to a specific National Spotlight article entitled Walt Disney is Frozen, He'll Be Back in 1975, and attributed to a writer named Bill Burnett. So I do think this article likely did exist and is probably the first published source for the rumor. Although it's been said that the rumor actually started within Disney itself as a joke among staff. Despite the nature of the publication that this story originated from, it still persists. To the point where some people are going to watch this video and be like, no, you're wrong, Walt Disney is frozen. And this rumor would evolve over the decades with little details added. Suddenly, Walt Disney was obsessed with his own mortality and trying to find ways to live forever. And that he had often specifically spoken about the possibility of freezing himself. That there was a weird amount of secrecy around his funeral. It was said that Disney created a movie called Frozen so that it would be more difficult to look up the facts about Walt Disney's frozen body. And at some point, it was said that he was stored right under Pirates of the Caribbean in Disneyland. Most recently, there was a screenshot making the rounds, mostly on Facebook, that Disney would be unfrozen in December of 2021 on the 55th anniversary of his death. The source of that being, much like the original story, a fake news publication, which in this case literally says it's not quite news. But just because Walt Disney isn't frozen, that doesn't mean there aren't people who are frozen. In fact, the very first person who was cryogenically frozen with the intention of bringing them back to life happened mere weeks after Walt Disney died. Every year on January 12th, cryonics enthusiasts celebrate a day known as Bedford Day, named for psychology professor James Bedford, who was frozen on January 12, 1967. Although there are other people who had their bodies frozen before Bedford, he's generally considered to be the first true example of cryogenic preservation. An article published in 1991 by For the Record entitled The First Suspension documents some of the previous failed attempts. There were a number of people who died before Bedford and had agreed to be frozen, but they couldn't proceed because of disagreements with family members, or doctors who were unwilling to help with the process. And if you want to freeze someone to bring them back to life, you gotta get things moving right away. There's no time for red tape. The closest they got before Bedford was an anonymous woman who died of a heart attack, but she had already been embalmed before she was frozen, which is a no-go if you want to be revived. But still, that was considered an important step towards the real thing. Bedford, who had been suffering from kidney cancer, was extremely passionate about cryogenic preservation, and even left money to cryonic research in his will. And knowing about all the problems that could occur when he died, and knowing that the clock was ticking for him, he made sure that he had all of his ducks in a row. And even with all that effort, his family still had to deal with legal issues. But by then, he had already been frozen shortly after his death. His freezing was overseen by a man named Robert Nelson, a former TV repairman who created the Cryonic Society of California. Bedford's body was injected with a solution intended to protect his organs from the freezing process. Although the materials they used are considered primitive by today's standards, and they likely didn't do a great job of protecting his brain, it was the best they had at the time, and still better than embalming fluid. He was then placed in a metal container called a douar. Bedford's douar was created by a man named Ed Hope, whose primary profession was making wigs. I love how that knowledge just instantly strips away any illusions you might have about what an advanced scientific process this was. And you may be thinking that this guy Ed Hope, sure he was a wig maker, but maybe he was just really passionate about the technology. A lot of people were at the time. And that's how science is sometimes, especially in the early days of a new technology. Some kind of citizen scientists, a modern day Ben Franklin. Nah, the truth is, Ed Hope just thought he could make a few bucks from this. And it wouldn't be that long after that he realized that he really couldn't make a few bucks off of this. James Bedford remains frozen to this day, but he is the only one of his contemporaries that does. And many of these people met with horrifying ends, largely in the aftermath of Ed Hope pulling the plug on his company, CryoCare. A 1992 article by For the Record entitled Suspension Failures, Lessons from the Early Years goes into some of these incidents. Basically, after realizing that CryoCare wasn't going to be as profitable as he thought, Ed Hope pulled the plug on the company. But now he's got all these dead bodies in jars to get rid of. You can't just throw them in the garbage or have a clearance sale. These are people. You gotta make some kind of arrangements. One example the article talks about is a woman named Eva Schulman. There was very little chance of ever bringing her back to life because before she was frozen, she had already been autopsied. Way too much time passed, but they froze her anyway because, hey, you got the cash, we got the metal tubes. So Ed Hope turns this woman's body over to her son, who keeps it on dry ice in his truck. Dry ice, which although it's very cold, is nowhere near as cold as the liquid nitrogen they use to preserve these bodies. So this dude's just driving his truck around with his mother's stinky autopsy lukewarm corpse in it. Like, at that point, you're basically just desecrating the body. Like, this is some kind of goofy mission you do early on in a GTA game. Eventually, he gets her a normal burial, though. And then you have the case of what's known as the Chatsworth incident. So Robert Nelson, the man who froze James Bedford, owns the Cryonics Society of California. He receives one of the bodies from Ed Hope, a man named Louis Nisco, who chose this company because they were the least expensive. Nelson continues to freeze more people, and he keeps them on dry ice in a mortuary. The mortuary is run by a man named Joseph Clockgather, who eventually decides that he doesn't want a bunch of frozen bodies laying around his mortuary. So Nelson comes up with a solution. They cut open Nisco's douar, remove his body from its supports, and then just stuff them all in there. I was told some were put in head first, some feet first, and it was like putting together a Chinese puzzle. The placement took most of a night. The bodies were not deliberately thawed, but must have suffered substantial warming, though according to Clockgather, they were still frozen. Then a welder resealed the capsule, which required a wait of several more hours, and it was refilled with liquid nitrogen. It's clear that at this point, Nelson had more or less given up on maintaining the integrity of these bodies. Like, even if you could thaw them out and revive them, moving them around like this had to damage them to the point where there's just no shot. But because Nelson's rates were so low, more and more people kept on coming to him to store their frozen dead relatives. So he wound up getting an underground vault at a cemetery in Chatsworth. He would eventually stuff 3 more bodies in a single capsule, this time one of them belonging to a dead 8-year-old girl. And that wasn't the only frozen child in his possession. There was also a 6-year-old boy who died of leukemia. His body wound up cracking, likely due to being frozen too fast. Meanwhile, Nelson would establish a sister operation in New Jersey, this one run by a cop named Nicholas de Blasio. In 1969, de Blasio's wife Anne would die of breast cancer. She was frozen by the Cryonics Society of New York. After speaking to Nelson, de Blasio was convinced that he could store his wife more cheaply on his own. And supposedly he also liked that he could see his wife frozen in a lifelike position. Ironically though, de Blasio's operations seemed to have less problems than Nelson's did. That is, until one disastrous incident. De Blasio also had capsules that contained multiple bodies. One of them malfunctioned after the lid was damaged opening it, so they take the bodies out, put them on ice, repair the lid and put them back. Then a year later, this happens again. And then another year later, this happens a third time. The third time, they finally say, you know what, we can't do this, it's done. So they arrange to give these people a proper burial, but they also have to salvage the capsule. It's a very expensive piece of equipment. A man named Mike Darwin would wind up having to scrape the liquefied human remains out of the bottom of the capsule. Back in Chatsworth, suspicion starts to arise about Nelson's operations, and his crypt is opened by local reporters. The stench near the crypt is disarming, wrote one reporter. Strips away all defenses, spins the stomach into 1,000 dizzying somersaults. The absolute state of decay in this crypt would lead to a big lawsuit by some of the families. But Nelson maintained that he had done nothing wrong, and that he had actually continued to maintain these tanks after the family stopped paying him, and ultimately he just chalked this all up to a failed experiment. I haven't done anything criminal, anything wrong other than a lot of bad decisions. It didn't work. It failed. There was no money. Who can guarantee that you're going to be suspended for 10 or 15 years? Ultimately, he would lose the lawsuit. But while Joseph Clockgather would wind up paying $400 grand, Nelson would only ever pay attorney's fees, despite being ordered to pay out over $1 million. After several decades passed, he would go on to recount his experiences in a 2014 book entitled Freezing People is Not Easy. In the book, he argues that he had previously made arrangements with the families who wound up suing him, and that they were really just after the insurance money. He also explains that he wasn't just some businessman out to scam people, and that he genuinely was interested in cryonics. And then 4 years later in 2018, he passed away. Upon his death, he himself was frozen. As for James Bedford, he managed to avoid all of this trouble because his son was so dedicated to making sure he was always taken care of. He's presently being taken care of by the Alker Life Extension Foundation. And although this company is generally regarded as being immeasurably more professional than those that came before them, they're not without their own share of incidents. Perhaps most famously, the story of Ted Williams. I'm not talking about Ted Williams, the man with the golden voice, who as far as I'm aware is still alive and not frozen, and still has his head attached. I'm talking about the baseball player Ted Williams. So I'm not a huge baseball fan, so as far as I can gather, he's generally regarded to be one of the greatest of all time. And in 2002, after a multiple year battle with heart disease and several procedures, he passes away at the age of 83. Unlike most of the other candidates for cryonic preservation, this was quite possibly not his choice. According to his will, Ted Williams wanted to be cremated, but ultimately it was his daughter Claudia and his son John Henry who had him frozen instead. This leads to a big legal battle between them and his other children. But the children in favor of cryonic preservation wind up presenting a note scrawled on a napkin signed by Ted Williams. It was an agreement that he would be frozen so that they could perhaps be together at a later date. A note scrawled on a napkin brought into court is, to quote a great man,
more sus than a character from Among Us.
But after investigating the note for potential fraud charges, a lab determined that it was actually authentic. So perhaps this really was what he wanted. But the procedure he received was a bit different from the others we heard about so far. Ted Williams was decapitated, with his head stored separately from his body. It's a procedure called neuropreservation. In theory, if you wanted to bring a person back from the dead and just keep the things that make them them, you only really need the head. Who needs a liver and kidneys and all that other crap? And in preserving the head by itself, there's a lot less that can go wrong. That's not to say though that nothing can go wrong. According to a report by Sports Illustrated several months after Ted died, his frozen head, which had been shaven and drilled into, had accidentally cracked 10 times. Also, a bunch of samples of his DNA just mysteriously vanishes for who knows what nefarious purposes. And at the time of publication, Alker was still owed $111,000 for the procedure. So Ted Williams, like most people who opt for neuropreservation, get decapitated from the start. But sometimes that happens at a later date. In 1984, Mike Darwin of Alker, who you might recall as the guy who scraped out the liquefied human remains in New Jersey, published research discussing the conversion of full-body preservation patients to neuropreservation patients. Conversion meaning they literally cut their frozen heads off with chainsaws. In doing this, they were afforded a rare opportunity to see what happens to a body after it's unfrozen after a long time. Essentially getting a little insight into what might actually happen if they reach their goal of reviving someone. What he found was that each of the bodies was full of fractures. Fractures that he compared to the appearance of paint peeling away from a wall. Fractures that occurred both on the skin and in the organs. But these findings weren't totally unexpected. In fact, he suspected that there was also damage at a molecular level that we just couldn't see with our eyes. He believed that these challenges weren't fully insurmountable, but he urged readers to opt for neuropreservation instead of full body. This is one reason why so many of us have elected for neuropreservation as opposed to whole body storage. The kind of repair technology which will likely have to be available to repair our brains will make regrowth of a new body a trivial exercise by comparison. New bodies are grown every day in nature right now, while freeze-injured and cryo-fractured brains are not repaired in nature at all. We urge everyone who is whole body to rethink the basis of their choice. If the basis of choice is concern over a severed spinal cord, or emotional concerns not related to the hard facts, we urge you to reconsider. So there you have it, folks. If you're thinking of getting frozen after you die, be sure to go Futurama style. But while the cryonics industry pushes further towards technological advancement and refinement, as futile as it may be depending on who you ask, there are still those who freeze their dead relatives the old-fashioned way. Every year since 2002, residents of Nederland, Colorado celebrate something called Frozen Dead Guy Days. The story goes like this. Bretto Morstel was the director of Parks and Recreation in Bærum County, Norway. He passed away in 1989 due to a heart condition, and his grandson, I'm absolutely going to mutilate this guy's name, Trygve Baug. He had Bretto frozen and brought to the US. Originally, he was kept in the Trans-Time Cryonics facility in Oakland, before he was eventually brought to Colorado to stay with Trygve and his mother, Aud. Like Nelson and de Blasio before them, they intended to make their own facility. But for now, they would just put Bretto in a shed and keep him frozen on their own. Trygve would eventually be deported due to visa issues, leaving Aud by herself. And while she was alone in 1995, she was going to be evicted for having no plumbing and electricity. Being evicted, of course, would jeopardize her ability to keep him frozen. So in hopes of getting her situation resolved, she brought her concerns to a local reporter. The reporter would then go to the city council on her behalf. And as a result,
Hey! I'm hit! Had enough? I'm hit! Damn! Come on! You like that? I'm hit! I'm hit! You like that? Hey! You like that? I'm hit! Hey, found you. I'm hit. I'm hit.
result,